Right, good morning, everyone. Just waiting for everybody to kind of connect and settle in. Great to see you all. Thanks for taking time out to join us this morning. I hope you've all been able to grab a cup of coffee and find somewhere comfortable to sit for the next 45 minutes or so. I'm sure we've got a few people that will drift in, as is the nature of these things. People will kind of slide in over the next 45 minutes or so. But in the interest of keeping to time and respecting yours, let's get rolling and get started. My name's Dave Rees. I'm the managing partner at Convergence Partners. Many of you will probably know me already, or you'll know one of the partners here. But for those who don't, I don't want to squander the opportunity to evangelise the Convergence Partners way. So hopefully you'll allow me a very brief introduction. Essentially, we are an executive and specialist recruitment firm. So everybody on the team here has got about 10, 15, 20 years experience, in some cases specialising in a particular functional area. We've been operating for over 10 years. We've appointed everything from executive team, leadership roles across pretty much every function you'd expect to see on a leadership team, through to the decidedly esoteric, including head of fin fish operations, actuaries of various types, and even a business manager for fruit physiology. So as you'll gather from that, our clients typically look to us to help them with leadership roles as well as specialist positions that they regard as hard to fill. And largely that's based on the fact that our core competency is the capability to combine what is a truly comprehensive and typically international market search with a best-in-class selection process. So we're all about finding and selecting exceptional talent. Now that's out of the way, and before I introduce Suzi McAlpine, our guest today, just a few housekeeping matters. So I expect we'll run for about 45 minutes in total. Roughly 30 of those will be my Q&A with Suzi. We welcome your questions and your comments. Feel free to put those in the chat section. And we'll address those in the 15 minutes or so that remain at the end. Now, I know from speaking with various companies over the last couple of weeks that people are also really interested in finding out what is being done in practice in the wellbeing space. So if you're open to sharing your ideas, your experiences in your own organisation, please raise your virtual hand through the conversation today. And when we reach that point, we'd love to give you some airtime. Otherwise, if you can keep yourself muted and ideally videos off, if you're comfortable with that, then that'll be fantastic. Right, so as you know, we are joined today by Suzi McAlpine, who's been waiting patiently there. As many of you will know, Suzi's profile has skyrocketed over the last few months following the release of her book, Beyond Burnout, which has quickly become a bestseller. When she's not a best-selling author, she is an executive coach, an international speaker, author of the award-winning blog, The Leader's Digest, and creator of the Leader's Map, which is an online leadership program for organisations wanting to better equip their emerging leaders. Something that Suzi was kind enough to give me a sneak preview of, and I have to say it's excellent. So I would highly recommend it. Suzi, great to have you here. Thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Dave. It's great to be talking to you today. It's wonderful. So thanks very much for having me.
You're welcome. How are things down in Nelson this morning? You got a bright and sunny day down there? Or?
It's always sunny in Nelson. You should know that. It never rains. It's beautiful. I've got my cup of coffee. I went to an F45 class this morning, which was all upper body, so I can hardly lift my cup of coffee. But apart from that, yeah, and actually this week is the first week in a long time I haven't had to jump on a plane. So it sort of feels a bit like a holiday in many ways.
Fantastic. Well, the last few months must have been an absolute whirlwind for you with all the media coverage you've got after the release of the book.
Yeah, it's the book has taken a life of its own. I think certainly it's hit a mark. It's a timely subject, and it's been pretty crazy, but fun. It's been a fun ride, and in some ways it feels like it's not mine anymore. It's weaving its way out into the world, doing its magic. So look, if any opportunity to raise awareness and to start to look at addressing burnout in our organisations, I'm all for it. So yeah, it's been fun.
Absolutely. Well, it's come at such a crucial time, which obviously you could never have planned, but nevertheless must be hugely satisfying to be able to help and contribute at a time when this is something that so many people are struggling with.
Absolutely.
I understand from reading the book that this isn't a purely academic exercise for you. So I thought perhaps just to sort of set the scene, could you tell us a little bit about how burnout came to be an area of focus for you?
Yeah, well, in my earlier role in executive search and as an executive coach, I've had a front row seat to a lot of burnt out leaders along the way. But I started to see a growth, a real growing trend of high stress and more leaders in particular who are experiencing burnout. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that and so I got a bit curious about that trend. This was 4 years ago. But the more I looked into it, the more I saw that although, the internet is awash with articles on burnout for the burnt out individual, how to spot it, how to address it, how to recover from it, this sort of annoyed me a little bit at first, and I wasn't quite sure why. But the more I researched the topic of burnout, I realised that we tend to be putting too much onus onto the individual for its prevention and cure. And I wanted to change the conversation, because when you look at the causes of burnout, which I'll go into it a little bit, they sit squarely in the organisational realm. They are baked into the ecosystem of an organisation. They have to do with leadership practice, of culture of an organisation, and systems and processes. So I wanted to write a book, not only for individuals who are experiencing burnout, but also for leaders and organisations so that they can tackle it. But I think the thing that really sparked it was that I have experienced burnout myself a while ago. And I'll tell you a little bit about the story, which I talk in my book. So it was in 2008, and from the outside, it looked like I had it all. My life was awash with shiny pinnacles of success and badges of honour, of professional honour. I was in my mid-30s. I had just come back from parental leave early. My youngest daughter was just shy of 6 months old. I had 3 children. And I had come back to lead a division of the New Zealand division of, it was a division of the world's largest HR consulting and executive search firm through the global financial crisis. And every morning I would jumble the kids into the back seat of the car, baby spittle on my crisp navy suit, munching down a piece of cold toast, and I'd careen out of the driveway and hurl the kids into their, respective daycares and schools before hurtling into Auckland CBD. And it was a Tuesday morning, and my son Nicholas was 7, and as I pulled up outside of his school, he turned to me and he said, his bottom lip trembling, "Mummy, can I have a hug?" Now, this was quite a big deal for Nicholas. He's not a physically affectionate kid. He had just been diagnosed with Asperger's, so he was struggling quite a bit at school. And I remember at the time thinking, that's just another thing on my to-do list to work out. And in that moment, when he asked me for a hug, his words didn't compute. And I remember looking past him and thinking about this presentation I had to give in 30 minutes. And I replied in a clipped, stressed out tone, "No, I don't have time." And I shoved him and his little backpack onto the pavement, and I drove off. And to this day, the look in his eyes in the rear vision mirror will haunt me. Needless to say, a few minutes later, I was outside of I was sort of pulled up on the side of the road, and, tears were sort of mixing in with the baby vomit on my suit. And it was as if someone had thrown a bucket of icy water in my face. I realized at the time, well, what I didn't realize at the time, and neither did my boss, was that I was suffering and demonstrating one of the key symptoms or red flags of burnout, and that is depersonalization. I didn't even have enough emotional, amount in the tank to be able to hug my wee man. And so you put all of those three things together, and I looked back, hindsight's a bitch, and I thought, we didn't know enough about burnout, what it is. It creeps up on people. And so that those three things sort of moved into a perfect storm to make me think this is the book that I want to write, because I've had a felt experience of burnout as well as witnessing it in organisations and leaders. So that's kind of how the book came about. Although I never knew 4 years ago that it was going to, obviously COVID was going to hit, which has exacerbated a lot of burnout and the causes of burnout. So, the timing of it is obviously landing pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess so much more powerful when, you can draw upon certain personal experience to be able to sort of motivate you during tough times. Obviously, writing a book, no mean feat. When we talk about the term burnout, I mean, I think we all know the term, but we're probably less familiar with what is the formal definition, what constitutes burnout versus just the stress that we feel due to big workloads and deadlines and pressure, etc. Can you give us a bit of a working definition and a broad understanding of what defines burnout?
Sure. So although the word burnout is part of our workplace vernacular, we often will say, oh my God, I'm so burnt out after that week from hell. True burnout is far more insidious. It creeps up on people. So burnout is a state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that's brought about by excessive and chronic stress related to your professional life. So you can feel really stressed out about other things, finances, your personal relationships. That sucks, but that's not burnout. And it's really important to note that stress in and of itself is not necessarily the problem. In fact, a certain amount of stress is not only really good for our performance, it's really good for our emotional and mental well-being. It's when that stress becomes chronic, unremitting, unrelented over a long period of time. It's almost like the extreme end of stress. That's when you see burnout come about. So once again, it's the state of emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion that is brought about by excessive and prolonged stress related to your professional life. It's almost like when the batteries won't recharge, when your tank won't fill up. And so, in fact, that's probably a good lead-in to talk about the three red flags, as I term them, or the three symptoms of burnout. The first is chronic exhaustion. So this isn't when you go away on holiday or you take a break and your tank refills up. It's almost as if, in fact, one of the symptoms is people will go away on holiday and they'll come back to work just as exhausted. So it's sort of completely fatigued, devoid of motivation. I talked a little bit, it's like your batteries won't recharge. So that's the first red flag, chronic exhaustion. The second one I thought was really interesting. It's an increased cynicism or depersonalization. That was like my Nicholas no hug moment. So you start to really disattach, disengage. You might get increased cynicism. So things that you could normally brush off before, you can't anymore. A frustration, a sense of what's the point? Why can I do that? And so that's the second red flag. And the third one, which can be really crippling for people, is a reduced sense of professional efficacy. So it's sort of hopeless. Nothing I do is making a difference. I'm working really, really hard. I'm digging deep, but I just can't do what I need to do to get the job done. One person who I interviewed for the book had a great metaphor. They said it's a bit like running a marathon in molasses. And so if you start to see those 3 red flags, and they were flapping furiously in my face, but neither my boss and I could pick it up. You know, that's a sign that burnout may be about.
Yeah, it makes sense. One of the things that really struck me reading the book, I was going to say surprised me, but it actually really shocked me, was just how prevalent it is. I think, I mean, there's a lot of data in the book, but one of the stats that stood out is the Gallup survey. I think it was from a couple of years ago, and 76% of employees experience burnout on the job at least sometimes. I think that's a stat, which is staggering.
Yeah, so it was the 2018 Gallup survey of over 7,500 employees, and 23% were experiencing, which is almost a quarter of the workplace, were experiencing burnout very often or always, and a further 44% were sometimes. And that's been backed up by other studies. Deloitte's, for example, said that, you know, in one of their pretty big studies, over 77% of people had experienced burnout. Closer to home, that's why the COGO workplace wellbeing survey that I use a lot in the book, you know, over 61% of, and that was a study of 1,500 New Zealanders and Australians, over 66%, I think it was either 66 or 67 more, you know, were experiencing extreme exhaustion. There was a recent study that's just come out last week by AUT, you can see it on LinkedIn, by Dr. Jared Haast, and there were some pretty scary statistics. So I think it's more prevalent than we had originally thought. COVID, once again, is also raising burnout rates across the world. There's some really interesting studies coming out. And the World Health Organization has reportedly just come out and said that if we don't address it, it's going to become a global pandemic within the next 10 years. So I think this is something that certainly chief executives and senior leaders need to really sort of perk up and lean into and take notice. It's probably more prevalent than we think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, on that note, I think as you explained, you know, there are some very obvious personal costs to individuals, but I think what's less clear is the organisational cost. And in terms of motivating change among organisations, casting light on those costs is probably more likely to catalyse action. Are you able to touch on facts and figures relating to organisational impacts? And also, I guess the flip side of that is the potential gains to be had from positive action.
Absolutely. So there was one of the big studies was there was a 2020 Tanner OC Tanner Global Culture Report, which I talk about in the book, and I won't go into bore you with the statistics, but what is absolutely overwhelming evidence is that burnout is having huge organisational costs. So, for example, burnout is the cause of increased absenteeism and presenteeism, and by quite a lot, over 200%. It increases employee turnover. It has negative impacts on employee engagement, productivity, pretty much any corporate health measure is affected by burnout and by quite a significant amount. It is not good for the bottom line. And so if you are a leader in an organization or an individual who is wanting to really influence the powers that be, there is a plethora of research which shows that it's really not good for the bottom line. It's not good for organisational health metrics, and it's really costing a significant amount to organisations, let alone the personal cost.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the things just in the research doing before speaking to you today that I found really powerful was the NZIER study that looked at the return on investment from wellbeing initiatives, which I thought would be a good sort of ammunition for people if they're trying to convince boards or CEOs. I think it was something like the return on EAP programs was 3.5 to 1. As a return on investment, and for wider organisational programs, it ranges from 2 to 1 up to 12 to 1. So, I mean, with statistics like that, there's really no argument for non-investing in this kind of space, I think.
Yeah, and I think also, Dave, when you start to look at the increasing rate of burnout, so you have that in one hand, and then you have the costs. It's a pretty compelling business argument, particularly if you are in an industry which has really higher rates than the average population. So certain industries and professions feature in burnout statistics and not in a good way. For example, the health sector, no surprises there. The legal profession, certainly teaching profession, and what I call human services profession. So whether that's emergency workers, certainly anywhere where that person or the employee is having to, they are the machine in some ways. I know I don't like to use it like that, but, professional services are another organisation which feature more higher. So if you start to put all of those things together, it's some pretty compelling evidence for organisations and leaders to start to look a bit closer at burnout.
Yeah, quite right. You touched on this earlier, but I know through the book that a core theme is that this is not so much an individual problem as an organisational problem. Can you talk through the rationale for that? And where I want to get to with that is the practical strategies that organisations can start to implement to really have an impact on this.
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I think for the most part, we have been treating burnout as if it's an individual problem rather than an organisational and a leadership problem. And this is a bit like treating the sick fish when it's the water that's contaminated. One of the reasons is that it puts too much onus on the individual to treat and address burnout when, the causes of burnout sit squarely in the organisational realm. That's not to say that individuals can do some really good things to help, prevent burnout. But I think we've got the scale wrong. There are 6 causes of burnout, which I'll talk to you a little bit in a moment. So I think what we need to do is to start to change the conversation, and we need to, I think leaders and organisations need to step up. So, for example, I just take this opportunity to talk about the 6 causes because you can start to see why leadership have been proven to have a huge lever on whether organisations experience burnout. There are 6 causes of burnout. The first one may not surprise you, it's overwork. So this is really not having the skill, the capacity, or being asked to do work without the resources to be able to actually achieve those. So long hours in and of themselves are not necessarily the problem, although anything past 50 hours a week, productivity tanks and the chances of burnout increase. So if people in your organisation are having to consistently work like 60 hours a week in order just to get the job done, I would be looking pretty closely at that. But there are 5 other causes of burnout, and some of them may surprise you. The other one, the second one is insufficient reward. So this is, am I doing enough, for what I'm putting in, am I getting sufficient reward for that? It can be financial, but it's not only financial. A lot of people go, oh, it's all about financial reward. It can be intrinsic reward. So am I valued? Do I feel valued? Does my boss, my direct manager, say, thank you for doing a fantastic job? So insufficient reward is the second cause. The third cause is a sense of isolation. And this can be caused by things like microaggressions, excessive politics, workplace politics, bullying. All of these sorts of things can add to isolation, and there are other causes as well. The fourth cause of burnout is an absence of fairness. So this is where things like perks, prestige, pay, there's inequity in the organisation around these sorts of things. So if I start to see other groups of people or people who are getting, treated more fairly than me, it can even be whether somebody's voice is heard in a meeting or not consistently. The fifth cause of burnout is a values conflict or mismatch. So it's when the individual person's values, personal values, is a real disconnect with the organisational values. And that one over time can put a cognitive and emotional load on someone, which can lead to burnout. And the sixth one, and this is a big one, is a lack of control over my work. And so this really talks to, do I have a say in how I do my work? And so we often say, here's what you have to do, but you also have to involve people in the how and the why. So increasing some form of control over how they do that and they carry out their work can reduce it. So when you look at all of those 6 causes, you really need to start to look at the root causes of those, and you'll start to see that leadership practices and organisational practices have a big lever as to whether people are going to experience burnout. So I think it's time that, we even up the scales in terms of responsibility for burnout. You can do mindfulness training, you can do resilience training, you can offer yoga, but burnout's not going to be fixed by a fruit bowl in the lunchroom. You've got to really look at those deep causes.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that the kind of knowledge of that is quickly emerging that that's just insufficient. What would you suggest? I mean, I know in the book you've got sort of the model of the 4 I's, and you break that down into 4 different aspects that organisations and individuals and leaders can use as a model for action. So could you perhaps sort of talk us through that and help people to sort of understand this as a framework for action?
Yes, well, I think one night after I'd had a glass or 2 of red wine, I came up with a nifty model with the ISAs. There are 4 strategies that organisations, leaders and individuals can take, so they can be applied at all of those levels, which I think will start to help us address burnout. They are recognise, destigmatise, socialise and organise. So I'll start with recognise. I think certainly what we can start to do is get better at recognising the symptoms and signs of burnout, those 3 red flags. I think certainly I would be focusing on upskilling and raising awareness in your leaders about what are the signs of burnout, what to look out, not only in themselves, but those that you can lead. From an organisational perspective, it's really around starting to go, where are we publicising and raising awareness? It might be an induction, it might be in different mechanisms, and so, in terms of recognising those symptoms, start to have conversations about stress and mental well-being in our organisations. It's not enough, though, just to recognise the symptoms, and that really brings us to destigmatise. Like a lot of mental distress in the workplace, burnout is shrouded in stigma. People are too afraid to put their hand up and say, I'm struggling or I'm feeling overwhelmed, because it's a career limiting move. And so we really need to change that. And this is where I say that leaders and organisations have a bigger role to play. If you have senior leaders having the courage to be vulnerable about their own mental journey, mental wellness journeys, and when they have experienced some form of mental distress, or whether if they've experienced burnout or how they've navigated their own high stress experiences, it makes it easier and it makes it safer for other people to do that. One CEO I know spoke openly to his team about his use. He said, I've used EAP. When you look at people like Craig Hudson, the chief executive of Xero coming out openly talking about his experiences of depression. It wasn't burnout, but that whole mental distress in the workplace. I think it's really important. We need to have more open conversations about mental health, create psychological safety and trust in leadership in teams. I think that's a pretty fundamental leadership practice. And even things like avoiding labeling, looking at your own mental models. One of the myths around burnout is that if you suffer from burnout, you're somehow mentally weak or you're a poor performer, when the research shows unequivocally that is not the case. In fact, some of your highest performers and most passionate may be most at risk. So there are different strategies, but I think it's really important that we start to look at how you destigmatize not only burnout, but mental distress in the workplace. The third strategy is socialize. So this is really about building purposeful social connection and encouraging social connection and I think a lot of organisations leave this to chance. It's not just, creating a football social team, although that may be the case. I think it's about weaving in how are we going conversations as well as what are we doing conversations. If I was a fly on the wall in most organizations, there are a lot of what are we doing conversations, task focused. That's great. We need that to get stuff done. But I think that there is a room for leaders in particular to start to build more meaningful social connection. Something as simple as a direct manager asking in a monthly one-on-one with their direct report, how are you? And then practicing active listening and full presence. It's about, maybe a leader in their team check-ins before you dive into the work, going on a scale of 1 to 10, how is everybody's wellbeing today, where 10 is fantastic, and what's driving that, and then really sort of enabling those conversations. Thinking, and once again, I go back to leadership practices. If your leaders are better coaches, if they are better at providing feedback, peer coaching programs can be really, really effective and don't necessarily, cost a lot of money. Things like having regular, purposeful monthly one-on-ones with people. So, and of course, working from home has made it more tricky, but I think that's around building social connection. I go into more detail about the book. And the final strategy is organize. And this really talks about, this has a huge lever on people's work. So looking at improving workflow design in organizations, reducing the people's pebbles in their shoes. I think that's a really good way of saying what are the sort of red tape and bureaucracy, and and ask your employees, what are those pebbles in your shoes that we can reduce. This seems really common sense, but it's things like prioritization, and that's at an organizational level and a leadership as well as an individual level. I was talking to a leadership team the other day, and they said, here are our 10 priorities for the next year. And I challenged them and said, well, that makes an oxymoron of the word. So certainly at a leadership and an organizational sense, organizations should really be only having 3 to 5 key strategic pillars. And if that work doesn't fall under that, don't do it. What can we ditch, delay, and delegate at an organizational leadership or team level? These are the things. I would also look at, clarity of communication. One of the biggest drivers of burnout is a conflict of conflicting demands or priorities. So are we being really clear about our priorities? And the other thing is that taking a sort of don't look at taking on organizational wide initiatives in isolation. Have a sense of what else is going on. We often underestimate what we can do in 5 years and we overestimate what we can do in 1. So it's that whole, what can we ditch, delay and delegate? Certainly, and speaking of delegation, this seems really simple, but I'm often surprised at something as simple, a simple leadership practice such as how to delegate effectively. So if you can improve the capability around delegation and prioritization in organizations, that's going to really help. And then finally, you want to look at, do we have a culture of overwork? This is a big one for lawyers. I was talking to a partner the other day, and he said, I'll work 70 hours a week, but I don't expect anybody else to. Well, once again, you've got to model what you expect in others. And so if people are consistently having to work like 60 hours a week just to get the job done, you might have a culture of overwork. We tend to treat work as inherently virtuous and rest as inherently lazy. And I think that's a mental model at a societal level we need to look at. How can we build in periods of reflection and pause, as well as action, and doing.
Absolutely. It's the kind of legacy of that Puritan work ethic, unfortunately, still with us. I think the thing that really struck me reading through the list, and there's an extensive list for each aspect in the book, so I really would encourage people to sort of deep dive into that by reading the book, is that so many of them are around communication. So it doesn't have to be, a super high budget exercise. There's a lot there that can be done on a very sort of cost-effective basis.
Absolutely. What I found was really interesting in the research about burnout is that leadership practices have a huge impact on whether people experience burnout. So even if employees feel that their direct manager and the organisation genuinely cares about them, that will reduce burnout rates. And these are simple leadership practices that if people can start to get a little bit more skilled across the organisation, they're going to have a big impact. So I look at things like mindfulness and resilience training and yoga, and they're all good, but they're the icing on the cake unless you start to look at look under the hood a little bit more about how you're actually organizing workflow. Are you involving people in the work that they do? Are you stamping out excessive workplace politics and bullying in your organization? Are you equipping your leaders across the organisation with some simple leadership practices? These are the things that are probably going to shift the dial most in terms of whether burnout's going to happen or not.
Absolutely. We could talk for much longer than we have today. But Suzi, that's been absolutely fantastic. I'm sure everyone's taken a ton of stuff away there. I know I have. And there's plenty of practical strategies, which is something I know people always value. We are sort of running short on time, but I know we do have a few minutes left for Q&A. If anybody is keen to put their question to Suzi, feel free to jot something down in the chat there.
Absolutely. Ask any question. Just while we're waiting for some people to pop in some questions in the chat, I've been really impressed by sometimes, what we talk about in terms of making it accessible, what's available. I was working with a group the other day, and someone said, this was a group of leaders, right? I was doing a leadership workshop on burnout. And one of them said, we've got EAP, and half the leaders in the room were not aware that their organisation had EAP. So if you have support services for your organisation, it's not enough just to shove it on the intranet, right? You need to shout about it. You need to be talking about it. Is it in your induction? Publicise what is available in many different ways. So sometimes it might be that you are doing something really well in a small part of your organization. I call it the positive flashpoints. How can you start to extrapolate that across the organization? Someone's just asked 2 of the red flags. So there are 3 red flags or symptoms of burnout. The first one is chronic exhaustion. So that's, think about the batteries won't recharge. There's no bounce back factor. You go on holiday, you're exhausted all the time. The second red flag is increased cynicism and or depersonalization, so a sort of a distancing, which can have huge effects, of course, in places like healthcare with patients. or teaching profession. And the third one is a reduced sense of professional efficacy. So I can't get the job done, I can't stay ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for going over that. And another question in the feed there is around prioritisation. So that is something that pretty much all organisations struggle with, and you don't necessarily see people getting sort of formal training on it, or it really, well, ironically, prioritised in an organisation. So have you seen any examples of organisations that do that well? And if so, what is it that they do differently?
Great question. I have the privilege of working with some amazing executive leadership teams, and it starts at the top, right? So, you know, I mentioned it earlier, but several organisations I work with, one in particular, they have a rallying cry, a thematic goal. If anyone's come across the 5 dysfunctions of a team, they have, so there are things that are always important, metrics like profitability and market share, but they have one rallying cry. So it is one thing that is the biggest prioritization, you know, for the organization for a period of time. They also have 3 strategic pillars that they focus on for a period of time, and they're really clear about saying no. If it does not fall into that, the kind of nice to have, the nice to do, they'll either delay it or they will say no. So learning to say no at an organisational level to the kind of interesting is one thing that I've seen done well. And the other thing that they do is that they're really good at that rallying cry, or those 3 strategic pillars, right, communicating that throughout the organisation, being really clear, not constantly changing that prioritisation. I mean, we have to be nimble and move that through, but it seems really simple, but it's fantastic. If you want to know more about the prioritisation, there's a fantastic book. It came out a couple of years ago, but it's still one of my favourites, by Greg McKeown, called Essentialism. And so if you want to know how to do it well, I would say that would be one of the things, one of the books to look into.
Yeah, absolutely. I can second that. Just keen to touch on you touched on there a few critical metrics. You know, companies obviously measure financial metrics and HR metrics too, but specifically regarding burnout or mental well-being, are you able to just talk?
Yeah. So the gold standard for measuring burnout is the Maslow burnout inventory. And so certainly if you are a larger organisation, or if you are in one of those higher risk industries, I would look into looking at the Maslow burnout inventory. And there's a couple of others as well. But certainly I would, if you're doing any sort of engagement surveys, if you are starting to look at your normal surveys, I would start to look at including some of those metrics and questions around burnout and mental stress in the workplace. I'm no researcher, but places like Kogo and other research organisations can certainly help you do that. But, you know, if you don't measure it, it's not going to get done. So I would certainly say those are, you know, the Maslow burnout inventory would probably, and they do that across a number of different industries and ways. So that would probably be the best.
Yeah, I mean, right now it seems, just from conversations I've had, that most organisations are just relying on the engagement survey, which probably doesn't give you the sort of granular detail you need to highlight this specific issue. Another comment in the chat is around agreeing that the tone at the top is all important, but not to abdicate responsibility for everybody in the organisation playing their own part and supporting each other. So the question is, how do we create the culture of caring when we're losing connection largely through working from home, flexible working models?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly because we've got this increase of working from home, I think it becomes more challenging, right? And so I think it's about, if you are a leader in an organisation, or you are leading a remote team, or you're having those remote working, you probably need to be a little bit more purposeful about that caring checking in with someone. This seems so trite, I can't believe I'm going to say it, but it's so powerful. Leaders who are great listeners, right? So, before you charge into work, something as simple as saying, you've got a one-on-one or you've got a meeting with an individual. How are you? So you may need to just check in. How are you going? Now, most people will go, I'm fine. But starting to build that trust and letting people know that you care, giving them really positive feedback when you see them doing things well, in an effective way. Active listening can be, just with your full presence, not checking your phone, it is important. The other thing is Zoom fatigue is real, right? We're all a bit over Zoom, and sometimes it's about looking at your technology. Sometimes just picking up the phone and having a conversation over the phone, checking in with somebody. I think can be really important. These things are simple, but they're just such great leadership practices, which can make people feel that you are genuinely caring. The other thing I would say is to get to understand your direct reports well. Each one of us is different. We need that, and so really understanding what are their strengths and enabling people to work from their strengths. That's shown to reduce burnout. Those sorts of things can really help build that sense of caring, especially when you're working from home. So, I think those are just some of the ideas that you can. My question is, what would make you think your direct manager genuinely cares about you? It's a good place to start. Do that,
100%, absolutely. Look, fantastic. It looks like everybody's had their questions answered, judging by the chat. I'm sure, like a lot of things, other questions will occur to everybody through the day, as these things always do. On that note, I would definitely encourage everybody to pick up a copy of the book. I mean, it's just absolutely packed with value and ideas and research around how to identify and combat this, not just for organisations, but there's sections there for individuals too. So I highly recommend it. And on that note, I mean, we've got 10 copies to give away to participants today. So we'll make that random draw over the next day or so, and send that out to people. And I should also say, Suzi very kindly sent us a worksheet that organisations can use just to cover off some of these the 4 key areas around the ISES. So we'll send that out along with a copy of the recording of this webinar. So that'll be in your inboxes probably early part of next week, if not later this week. Mm-hmm. So all that remains is to thank everybody for coming today. I'm sure everybody's got huge value from it. I know I have. And Suzi, it's been absolutely wonderful. So thank you very much.
It's been really wonderful. Thanks, Dave. I'm going to leave everybody with a little challenge. We tend to notice what's not working in our organisations and our people. And sometimes, people can be Teflon coated for the good and Velcro for the bad. It's a really little thing, but I challenge everybody to give somebody some positive, specific feedback today to someone in their team or someone that they're leading. Just catch people doing well, shine a light on what you want to see grow. So that's my final soapbox moment. Thank you so much for having me, Dave. It's been really great, and I've had a great time. So thanks for that.
Fantastic, and I love that final message. So we'll end there, but thanks everybody for attending, and thanks again, Suzi.
Okay.
Cheers, Ed. Bye-bye.